Welcome to this webinar, which will review effective approaches to evidence inventory documentation. As a reminder, the information provided in this webinar is the property of Middle States Commission on Higher Education, and the reproduction, distribution, and transmission of this presentation, in part or in whole, is expressly prohibited without written consent from the Commission. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Terrence Peavy, and I'm the Vice President for Institutional Field Relations here at Middle States. I'm accompanied by Dr. Sean McKittrick, also Vice President for Institutional Field Relations, and also the co-presenter for today's presentation. We remind participants that although we speak in some detail about providing documented policies and procedures and guidelines, the Commission does not require such for every single criterion of every single standard, because they may not exist. Simply stated, the information provided here is in the form of advice we give after reviewing good practices from institutions that appear to have performed well in their self-study evaluation process, including the development, refinement, and use of evidence inventory. To facilitate receiving questions, we will use the Q&A option provided in the participant panel. Please ask questions through this venue. This is your chance. Our main goal today is to learn more about the overall expectations for evidence quality, and we will do this by participating in discussion and the question and answer session. We will also endeavor to understand the differences between policies, procedures, and guidelines and structures as they relate to quality of evidence and the need to ensure accessibility, accuracy, comprehensiveness, and efficiency when developing and implementing an evidence approach. We will then evaluate various expectations regarding well-functioning evidence approaches based on good practices in higher education and other sectors. So let's begin. For the purposes of today's workshop, we use the term evidence inventory to mean the repository of documents institutions assemble in preparation for their evaluation visit or some compliance event, be it a visit by an institutional or program accreditor. In the past, institutions have used an evidence inventory, document roadmap, document room, or other instrument that they point accreditation evaluators to in order to document compliance. Evidence is required under the Commission's accreditation review cycle and monitoring procedures. The institution will upload the self-study report and all supporting evidence to the secure Middle States portal on the due date by the close of business at 4:30 p.m. The due date is no later than 6 weeks prior to the on-site evaluation visit. No doubt, the evidence inventory is relevant because we all want to go to a resource where we, as evaluators and commissioners, can refer to references found in the self-study narrative and documents that can be used by team members to confirm and clarify compliance. And do not forget, this goes for institutional priorities as well. You have spent untold hours aligning your institutional priorities with your institution's mission and goals and commission standards. A well-crafted evidence inventory can be used for both compliance and peer review of your institutional priorities. Why not ensure the value added of your evidence inventory by addressing the common expectations of quality? Most of us roll our eyes when we hear the words document and accreditation are used in the same sentence because of the horror stories we've heard about documentation approaches that have provided thousands of pages, hundreds of links, and otherwise voluminous amounts of information that have sometimes been unwieldy and difficult to manage. As one evaluator once said, quote, "I needed a forklift to access the documentation when a nicely assembled and organized wiki would have been just fine," close quote. This does not mean that the evidence inventory is the only tool to be used by self-study evaluating team members. Of course not. But developing a well-crafted evidence inventory should enhance the process. Work on the evidence inventory as a part of the overall process should be added value to institutions in the short and medium term. We hope that your participation in this webinar will help alleviate those concerns. Along those lines of evaluator feedback, Commission staff have reached out to evaluators to ask how the Commission could improve in providing tools, training materials, and guidance in the interest of improving member institutions' performance during the accreditation visit. Those who responded to surveys and who participated in focused conversations on the topic of evidence quality offered the following observations. Evaluators expressed some concern that information found in the evidence inventory seemed to have little connection to the self-study document narrative itself, making it difficult to confirm claims made in the self-study document. On occasion, documents and the self-study narrative itself have contained institutional lingo and document titles that were very difficult to understand. Finally, evaluators shared concerns that evidence provided by institutions have very little relationship to the standards and their criteria. Labels and links contain words and phrases that were difficult to understand and contain thousands of pages when samples were due. There's much to be learned from institutions that have excelled in this area, pointing out that some institutions have particularly excelled in the area of developing and leveraging linkages between the self-study report and the evidence inventory. In fact, a fair number of institutions have appreciated efficiencies through well-developed evidence inventories approaches, therefore making room for a more careful and productive evaluation of mission, strategic goal, and institutional priorities. Conversations with commission and evaluators, along with studies from the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and the International Standardization Organization, ISO, offer 4 elements of effective evidence approaches. Utility. Whatever evidence approach is provided by institutions to provide documentation attesting compliance with standards and their criteria, the documents included in the evidence inventory approach contain information that is useful to both the institutional stakeholders and the evaluators. Included documents are limited within a certain time range and a focus on documenting compliance to specific criteria. Objectivity. Provided evidence is objective when the presentation of documentation is effective and contains sufficient, yet is restrained to information that is complete, reasonably unbiased and accurate, and appropriately representative. Integrity. An effective evidence inventory or documentation approach has integrity when it is appropriately secure and reasonably accessible. Confidential information is effectively protected, and an institution has given thought to ensuring information is secure, respecting national, state, and local regulations. Labels do not include institutional lingo and contain evidence consistent with such labels. Reproducibility. Useful evidence inventories contain information that is reproducible because evidence is backed up on servers, or there is some kind of backup plan to ensure, should access be limited due to something outside of the control of the institution, relevant information that still can be provided to evaluators. In most cases, this is addressed through appropriately implemented information technology data backup plans. In addition, transparency means that the information provided to evaluators is reflected through the answers to interview questions during the course of the visit. This does not mean that institutional stakeholders must memorize what is in the evidence inventory, but the evaluation team members can reasonably confirm what is said in interviews with documentation found in the evidence inventory. At this workshop, we will approach the topic of developing an effective evidence inventory approach, keeping these aspects of relevance in mind. In what follows, we endeavor to do this through a focus on 2 elements, both equally important. Let's start with institutional capacity, which is the ability for an institution to apply its own policies and procedures through appropriate administrative structures, which is informed by regular review, systematic and periodic assessment, and continuous improvement processes. One of the 2 areas that we'll address in some depth this afternoon has to do with the documenting of the institution as appropriate capacity to remain sustainable compliance with commission expectations. Institutions can do this in a myriad of ways, including through self-study narrative, group interviews during the evaluation visit, and so forth. One way to leverage the good work being done when organizing an institution's evidence inventory is to see if an institution has policies, procedures, guidelines regarding relevant criteria identifying offices responsible for the implementation of such, and then ask if the institution and/or its units have evidence in the form of documents, process maps, charts, and so forth, which they might be included in the evidence inventory for use by the institution's steering committee, its working group, or by evaluation team members. Asking these questions can help an institution address its capacity for complying with commission expectations in what we call institutional capacity, and which constitutes a major portion of the rubric to be addressed today. I'd like to suggest an approach that might help your campus representatives and evaluators appreciate how comprehensive your institution's compliance with the Commission's requirements, standards, and criteria. The approach is one of several, but could be helpful. For a given criterion or a Commission expectation, institutional policies. What is expected? Is there a policy or group of policies that relate to the criterion? Get that document and place the cover page or place the subheading that says policies. Institutional procedures and guidelines. How is it done? Is there a procedure directly related to that policy? Create a policy diagram, flowchart, or narrative describing the process. Place that in the evidence inventory with a subheading procedures or related procedures. Institutional and unit structures. Who or what is responsible for doing it? Sometimes the process document you work on already has this. 4, document and assessment information. What shows we have done it? Provide representative information and/or appropriate samples demonstrating that your institution is successful in achieving the goals and objectives of the policy, and appropriately representative of comprehensive information of such compliance and, where applicable, Commission expectations. Of course, this is not the totality of what should be included, but it is a start. In a sense, where such information is available and appropriate, it provides a sense of infrastructure and structural support for compliance with Commission expectations and for other kinds of review. Depicted in the blue arrows to the left, institutions might review the language of each criterion and identify institutional policies, then identify documents or even depict in their own diagram what institutional procedures and guidelines exist with regard to each criterion. Then identify the institution's organizational structure, and then use the entire exercise to then identify appropriate evidence to include in the evidence inventory. Some institutions could also do the opposite, depicted by the green arrows in this diagram. They review each criterion, then evidence, then the institutional units responsible for each, followed by the identification or their own depiction of the procedures and guidelines, followed by the institutional policies that support such policies. So at this point in our presentation, we'd like to offer a poll for our participants. The poll question today is, what policy or policies will influence your evidence inventory strategy? We have the list of choices here, and in a few seconds, you'll actually have the opportunity to fill out the poll. We'll give it a minute or so just to allow everyone the opportunity to vote. You have one option. It's not multiple options, just pick one answer, and we'll see what we come up with. The poll should be appearing right now. We're adding up the votes. All right, let's see what the results are of this poll. Okay, right now with 28%, I see institutional assessment policy. At 22%, we have policies on policies, as well as strategic planning policies. And at 18, we see student learning assessment policies at the program level. So what we'll do is we'll put the results into the deck that we'll send to you after the presentation, but this was very interesting and maybe a part of the latter part of this presentation. Let's move on to our next slide. As an illustration, let's consider a typical institution's endeavor to demonstrate compliance with the Commission General Education Assessment expectation. Usually, institutions want to demonstrate right away their general education student learning outcomes, assessment results, the consideration of these results by key stakeholders with resulting recommendations, and listing of the documentation of the implementation of such recommendations as pervasively applied across the institution. Straight out of the gate, institutions consider documenting each of these through narrative, data, and proof. We recommend first taking a step back and point evaluators and commissioners and others who might use this evidence inventory to evaluate an institution's extent of compliance with the Commission's expectation for general education by, as discussed, identifying, documenting, and communicating policy, procedures, and structures as they relate to general education. Here, we provide a hypothetical example of an institution's initial endeavor at identifying its policies and procedures as they relate to general education, usually found in a document like this. Note that this is not a commission requirement, but an initial presentation of general education policy can go a long way in helping those external to your institution understand the context behind the general education curriculum and how it affects assessment. Not here that our hypothetical institution relates to the general education student learning outcomes to its mission and vision, an emerging practice for some of those member institutions. Let's take a deeper dive and see what an institution might do to explain its general education course approval process. Here, our hypothetical institution depicts a course approval process so evaluators can understand the process accompanied by an organizational chart answering who is responsible for implementing the processes related to this. The process is represented through a workflow diagram, and those responsible for implementing the process are represented in an organizational chart. Of course, there are multiple ways of doing this, but this uses a strategy that enables evaluators and commissioners to explain an important process upfront and identify whom they should go to when they would like a further explanation or would like to discuss the process. And here, an institution represents a general education result over a 2-year process in multiple categories of the institution's general education student learning goals, including mathematical reasoning, social science reasoning, humanistic inquiry, and other areas. Note here that the institution not only represents its general education results, but it also represents in the final column what it appears to be the demonstration of how the general education assessment process resulted in improvement. The results of this table might lead to an appropriate narrative in a self-study document about what actions were taken to evidence such improvements, or 2 conversations between the self-study and evaluation team members and an institution's representatives to evaluate the institution's compliance with Commission requirements of affiliation and standards of accreditation. Commissioners would also be able to review this to evaluate compliance. Note also that the table is comprehensive enough, and it would seem to enable its readers to initially skim through its content initially to know what the table purports to represent and quickly evaluate the extent to which it is useful to them as they perform their work. It is definitely succinct, it is skimmable, and can serve as a source document placed in an evidence inventory to use in writing evidence-based self-study narrative. Some institutions even find room for such a table in their self-study document itself. Again, the Commission does not require such an approach, and there are other ways, but it is an emerging practice that some institutions use with at least a modicum of success. Another example, in this case, appears to be a general education category outlined in blue, with the year of last review outlined in green, followed by assessment by an assessment team that considers assessment reports with their recommendation, and then including in the final column to the right and outlined in red with some evidence of implementation to carry out targeted recommendations made by the evaluation team and assessment team. With perhaps a few cosmetic changes to enhance readability, this document condenses an assessment process in terms of subject, year accomplished, findings, recommendations, and action. A recent review of self-study reports and evidence inventories in the last 2 years conducted by the Commission, institutions are increasingly using exhibits such as these, either used in the self-study chapters themselves or more commonly in the evidence inventory portals to provide succinct information. And this need not only be presented in the table form, and we want to be clear that the focus here is not the concise presentation of information. This could be done in a page or two in a well-focused and well-written self-study narrative. But note here that the evaluators and the commissioners can initially skim through this and probably in a few pages of an exhibit within an evidence inventory to confirm and clarify compliance within the Commission's expectation, conclude that is focused enough to warrant more careful review as the readers do their work. At this point in the presentation, I would like to bring in Dr. McKittrick to discuss evidence quality. Dr. McKittrick.
Thank you, Terrence. We now turn to issues and some of our own recommendations regarding evidence quality. As we noted earlier, it's often difficult to assemble an evidence inventory in ways that enable those not employed at an institution to access information readily and in reference to specific agency expectations, such as those associated with the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. In the past, the Commission has reached out to its more experienced evaluators to identify some of the more desirable aspects of evidence quality. Such outreach has led us to identify 4 primary hoped-for aspects or qualities associated with an effective evidence inventory. Quality evidence is 1, accessible. Evidence for this criterion can be retrieved in ways that enable users to access information needed even when they are not familiar with the institution. 2, quality evidence is accurate. The evidence provided for a criterion is technically correct and current. 3, quality evidence is comprehensive. Evidence is sufficient to address compliance with a given criterion, both institution-wide and, where applicable, for individual units. And 4, quality evidence is efficient. Evidence provided for this criterion is concise, and it enables users to perform their work in a timely fashion. So let's look at each of these in turn. Evidence is technically correct and current. No doubt, technical accuracy is a key element of an evidence inventory. Evidence must be accurate to evaluators, external stakeholders, to staff, faculty, students, administrators, board members, and others in order to maximize use or to be useful in general. For the purposes of the evidence inventory, evidence should clearly reference what offices and individuals are associated with the evidence included in the evidence inventory along the lines of what Terrence was able to share with us just earlier. This means that documents and other information should contain clear references to the individuals or units that were responsible for developing such evidence, so evaluators know whom to interview when they desire to do so during the course of an evaluation visit. Appropriate evidence should also be reasonably current. Evaluators, commissioners, and those that otherwise use the evidence inventory should be able to gather a sense in short order that the information provided is the latest version and is therefore represents the current, not necessarily only the past and not the future necessarily, status of the institution's compliance with commission expectations. Finally, information provided should be precise. Information included underneath the veneer of evidence inventory labels or file names should indeed be precise. They should sharply focus on what the criterion or the file name it is meant to evidence, instead of containing voluminous copies of redundant and barely related information. Providing technically correct and current evidence enables your institution to provide examples of policies, procedures, organizational structures, assessment information, as Terrence has taught us this afternoon, and contextual information that gets the job done without key individuals having to explain over and over where information might be located. It also complements the self-study narrative because it supports claims made there by providing the latest information available directly and compellingly. Institutions, evidence is sufficient to address compliance, both institution-wide and, where applicable, for individual units. Institutions are responsible for ensuring that the documentation they provide is comprehensive. Now, comprehensive means that they provide sufficient evidence that addresses compliance at institutional and unit levels in substantial measure. Information provided should contain information that demonstrates compliance across an institution. That is, it is pervasive enough across an institution, both at institutional and unit levels, to lead one to reasonably believe that an institution complies with commission expectations in substantial measure. Together with the self-study narrative and on-site interviews, as a result of the peer review process, members of your institutional community, your self-study evaluation team members, commissioners and commission staff can understand the argument for compliance in ways because they've been able to access information that has been appropriately representative, meaning that the evidence inventory and the related self-study narrative contains an appropriately representative sample of what the evidence inventory labels or file names claim to provide compliance with. Think appropriately representative samples of syllabi in the evidence inventory, not all syllabi, if that is the institution's choice to provide syllabi as evidence. Think about providing assessment reports that lead evaluators and others to confirm that the institution engages in periodic, systematic, and sustained assessment across all programs, not just for those programs approved by specialized accreditors, should you choose to provide such exhibits in the evidence inventory. Notice here a hypothetical institution that's chosen to list several programs on a table, followed by the college it's associated with and each program it belongs to. The institution then lists programs by type of assessment, then lists indications of when the assessment information was summarized and when the results were last discussed by faculty. Such a spreadsheet may go on for several or even many pages, depending on the size and complexity of the institution. But the strategy seems to be associated with establishing a nice snapshot of the quality of the assessment process across the institution. Note here that the institution has taken the same table to represent the quality of the assessment process to date by color coding degrees of compliance. Here, in this example, cells in green might mean good, those in yellow might mean getting there, and orange might mean much work is needed. Now, a risk of using such an approach as this is that a spreadsheet can go on and on. The institution may have hundreds of programs and units, but it is a good start And several institutions have chosen to provide this kind of exhibit in their evidence inventories because one can skim through this and generally see where the issues are, where they have been, and what the status of the assessment process is. An institution can even refer to this table in the self-study document to provide a useful evidence-based account of the status of compliance with the Commission's assessment expectations. It can be a very effective practice as long as it directly relates to claims made in the self-study document. But what if the institution is medium to large in size, making the review of this kind of spreadsheet like this quite a chore? I mean, the information is accurate, it is comprehensive, and it certainly seems complete. But if the exhibit is 30 to 50 pages long, containing many amounts of spreadsheet data, the information is likely not to be concise as it could be. Efficient review of all that information could be difficult to achieve. And access to all of this information could also be a problem because there's so much information to review with so little time. One very effective process used by some institutions has included the use of checklists, templates, and rubrics developed by institutions undergoing self-study to represent the quality of their assessment efforts in self-study evaluation reports or in evidence inventories or both. This emerging practice begins with requiring all units on campus to submit annual reports where they, 1, depict their learning or unit goals, 2, display assessment results, 3, provide evidence-based accounts of how key institutional stakeholders, such as faculty, staff, and institutional leaders, consider the results and make appropriate recommendations, and 4, use the results to enhance student learning or unit performance on the goals and budgeting, planning, the enhancement of unit performance, or even student learning over time. Some institutions go a bit further. In employing such a template, the result becomes the presentation of a table in the evidence inventory of the self-study document itself that summarizes the quality of the assessment process over the years by using a rubric to evaluate each annual assessment report according to clarity, the quality of the nature of assessment methods, the quality of discussion and consideration by key stakeholders, and the linkages of such discussions and consideration to budgeting, planning, and the improvement of student learning. A table and even a graph that presents the results according to the application of this rubric can also be provided as seen on this slide. In addition, one could also use this to interact with one's superiors in one-on-one meetings to demonstrate current performance and plan for future performance. Now, we are not saying that this approach is at all mandatory. Every approach has its strengths and weaknesses, but it's used here as a simple example. It has been used with some success by institutions wanting to paint a general picture of the extent of compliance with assessment expectations accompanied by documents found in the evidence inventory. So evaluators and others can confirm the institution's evidence-based self-study narrative and clarify with stakeholders when any questions remain. They look at the table, they look at the graph, they look at the self-study narrative that accompanies it, and then they go to the evidence inventory to confirm and clarify. Again, it is important to note now that a drawback of this approach is that, of course, we're assuming that all evaluators are comfortable with the use of methods such as this. And there may be work to be done on the cosmetics of this presentation. Not all approaches need to feature metrics, especially if yours is a smaller institution. An institution could apply the same pattern even without numbers. They instead provide examples of annual reports to rehearse our example in the self-study narrative itself, and then refer evaluators to a larger sample contained within the evidence inventory for their review. Such a process works particularly well if the institution is smaller than others. In the form of graphs, tables, spreadsheets, annual reports, and so forth, the pattern is to provide information in summary form in the self-study narrative, and then provide information in the evidence inventory that contains a slightly larger, appropriate sample of reports so evaluators can confirm compliance with commission expectations and clarify issues that emerge after reading related claims made in the self-study document as it relates to the evidence. Evidence provided for this criterion is concise and enables users to perform their work in a timely fashion. Enabling evaluators, commissioners, and your own staff and faculty to perform their work efficiently is key, of course, to developing and managing a successful process of making claims in the self-study document and supporting those claims in a well-developed evidence inventory. An efficient evidence inventory should facilitate, not detract from, efforts to confirm and clarify by team evaluators ongoing compliance with commission expectations. Information provided in the evidence inventory should enable evaluators, obviously, then to do their work within a reasonable time frame without a need for them to understand complexities of institutional culture, nomenclature, or lingo. Some institutions provide a glossary of institutional terms, which is a notable emerging good practice across the commission membership. But if such a glossary, however, requires careful study and restudy by those using the evidence inventory, then it may need further work. Documents found in the evidence inventory should generally relate or cross-reference to the self-study narrative, and this should be checked often to ensure that the evidence inventory facilitates review. Documents included in the evidence inventory might contain titles that are either referenced in the self-study narrative or mapped to the standards in their criteria. Evidence should be so organized that users can easily see the relevance of each document to commission and other regulatory expectations, a concept known as skimmability. An evidence inventory should not contain an exhaustive compendium of all possible documents that evaluators or institutional stakeholders might feel they need in order to conduct a rigorous review. A so-called kitchen sink approach is undesirable because it diminishes or waters down your most impactful and significant documentation. At a minimum, providing voluminous amounts of documentation without much reference to the criteria or to the self-study, some of which seems less relevant than desirable, can prove the patience of even the most saintly of evaluators. Providing monitoring reports, periodic reports, or substantive change submissions from over 5 years ago often seems less relevant than other more current evidence. Evidence having to do with fire codes, state legal opinions, sewage and wastewater systems are always less than desirable because it's unclear what their relationship is to accreditation-related standards and expectations. Consider this example used with the institution's permission. As part of its recent self-study process, the institution provided a succinct summary of the evidence inventory that could be found at the end of each chapter of the self-study report. Evidence was provided by the institution to enable evaluators to skim through the labels to see what information was provided. Reviewers and commissioners would, in this case, be able to skim through this list and gather at least an initial sense of what kinds of information are included in the evidence inventory. Or they might review this and say, I think I need to ask for additional information. The labels do not appear to contain information with too much institutional lingo, and the information appears succinct enough to enable evaluators to do their work. Those using this evidence inventory approach can quickly understand which criterion of standard 6 in this case the evidence relates to and what information each element contains. And one can skim from top to bottom and sense from the beginning what kinds of information are subject to review. Not a required approach, but it worked for them. Evidence provided for this criterion is well organized and keeps principal audiences in mind. If an institution elects to use an electronic interface, either of its own making or purchased by an institution, such as a third-party vendor, evaluators should not be expected to have the same technical skill as those who developed the interface or know how to navigate it. There have been cases where evaluators have been greeted by institutional leaders excited about a new approach to accessing documents in the evidence inventory, only to observe that evaluators find the technology difficult to navigate and require many refresher courses more than once during the course of the visit. No need to be a Luddite here, but just make sure that the limited links you're allowed to provide are not broken and that technological access is understandable, even to a true semi-technophobe as myself. And that would be significant. The evidence inventory should also employ well-written labels that make it clear or easier for evaluators and others who may not be familiar with the institution to do their work. Usually this means, again, that the labels directly relate to commission standards, criteria, and requirements. So again, evaluators can do their work. Labels should never parrot specialized or technical language that constitutes a barrier to understanding about how to conduct fair, equitable, and consistent review. So as you may have noted, always keep 3 audiences in mind when developing, refining, and using your evidence inventory. The institution uses the evidence inventory and is a primary audience, and it's important to keep in mind that your stakeholders are an audience. Evaluation team members are also an important audience because they use the information to evaluate your institution. And please do not forget, commissioners and commission staff are an important audience. Commissioners will sometimes refer to the evidence in the evidence inventory to conduct their own independent evaluation. Keeping these 3 audiences in mind, construct your evidence inventory and start early. As I remind the institutions I work with, think of an evidence inventory as a work of art needing consistent refinement over a limited amount of time. You'll probably first encounter something vaguely resembling what you see as a work of art. Then, after consulting with key people in the know over time, refine, 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 adding documents when needed, taking them out when they seem less related to the standards and criteria, and so forth. And again, consult with the people who would know what evidence is most effective at your institution. It's definitely a team effort. So on this slide, a few points are worth re-emphasizing. Again, labels and sub-labels should be short but meaningful, ordered as expected, kept simple, and are consistent across your self-study document and your evidence inventory. Why do this? You do want to enhance skimmability, an ability to initially look at your exhibits and say, this is what I need to do. It empowers review, minimizes time to task, and enables a thorough review. Now, you don't have to listen to me anymore. We get to engage in a bit of an exercise. So let's now turn to the workshop exercise for this webinar. You should have received a packet by email with instructions for this exercise. Don't worry, don't panic right now if you cannot find it quite at this moment. So in the next slide, we presented basically, if you want to look this up, we tried to provide it in the packet of information, but if you want to use the standards for accreditation booklet, here it is. We're going to look at standard 3, And we're going to look at Criterion 2 as outlined in the red arrow on this slide. Next slide, please. So here's what we're going to do. Each of you should have received the workbook by mail. If you haven't, again, don't panic. We'll provide some information for you. In the workbook, review hopefully you've had a chance to review the definitions we provided, and the list of documents that are, for our purposes this afternoon, is simply what you would consider as labels in an evidence inventory. Then use the table to provide your first impressions, the table that asks you to identify strengths and weaknesses as it relates to accessible, accurate, comprehensive, and efficient exhibits. Think of some suggestions that you might make based on some of the concepts we discussed here in this webinar, and then be prepared to share some of your thoughts with us. So in the next page, you should have seen, or slide, this is what the packet looks like. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. The next slide, please. Here is what the faux evidence inventory looks like for the fake institution. I hope this doesn't currently exist. I made this up. Poughkeepsie Institute. I like the city of Poughkeepsie, so I put it down as Poughkeepsie Institute. And what this institution has provided is a list of evidence labels. And so part of this exercise is going to be, next page if you could, next slide, sorry, is look at it and ask, are there any issues with accessibility, accuracy, comprehensiveness, and efficiency, and complete the table. Next slide. So we're going to conduct this via chat. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple of minutes, and I want you to review what you've concluded. If you haven't had a chance to do so, we're going to give you a couple of minutes, really. But if we could go back to the evidence inventory labels, as we call it, this. Oh, wrong one. Sorry about that. The next one, this right here. And what I'd like you to do is just take a look at this for a couple of minutes and think, are there any issues with access? Are there any issues with accuracy, comprehensiveness, or efficiency? So let's just take a minute or two, and then we'll open up the chat as we have a chat-based discussion. So there's going to be silence for 2 minutes. It doesn't mean I've left.
Hedrick, there's one other thing to remind you. We actually have a copy of the workbook in the chat. So for those of you that do not have the workbook, if you go into the chat, there should be a PDF there. Give us one moment and we'll repost the workshop evidence again. One second.
Give you a little bit over a minute. Okay, so that was fast. I'm going to put my co-presenter Terrence on the spot a little bit. Terrence, when you look at so when we constructed this evidence inventory, this actually isn't all that bad, right? There's areas of improvement. So we didn't put a bunch of red meat in here. So what thoughts, Terrence, might you have about, does anything strike out at you as maybe some work could be done on this?
I think one of the key areas that you actually spoke to in your presentation was just skimmability, and definitely this has the potential to be more skimmable than some of the things that we've seen in our work. So I would definitely kind of bring that to light. But I'm also just very interested in hearing the audience. And just I don't want to sway the audience in terms of what they see, but I think that was just a really strong theme throughout our presentation, is just giving the evaluators and the commissioners the opportunity to really understand and evaluate the work.
Thank you, Terrence. Thank you very much. So somebody just said on the chat, I think that I just saw, was very diplomatically put, an abundant use of abbreviations, right? So that has to do with access and probably efficiency, because you're going to have to go out and ask somebody what this means. So if you're not an institutional researcher, you may not know what TTD means, which is time to degree. And a Poughkeepsie success coach, I'm not sure what that means. It probably means they're faculty, right? But is my guess. But yeah, there are a lot of abbreviations that may be a little bit, not a huge problem, but there are a couple of things that might need work. Anything else in the chat that I can see? Let me think. Any other thoughts? Terrence, can you see anything in the chat?
I'm looking now.
Sorry.
One participant said the document looked a little succinct, but it could be confusing to individuals who don't do it regularly. See here. Let's see. Right, and someone also agreed with what you said with regard to being broken down for further access and efficiency. And someone also mentioned it should be a little bit more comprehensive. Too many large documents was also a comment made. Labeling could be a lot more consistent. sub-criteria are out of order in the list.
Interesting.
And appears not to be organized by standard or criterion.
That's right.
Someone asked, why no bolded text above 2? It's a good question.
That's right. I mean, I think one of the issues that we might find here is that I think 2C is not bolded. We don't have a category for 2C, right? I mean, not a label category, so it might be good.
Someone felt that the general documents may not be as helpful. Again, a mention of the inconsistency in formatting.
Okay, good.
Hyperlinks could be used to ensure accuracy for anything that is also public facing. Good.
Fantastic.
Some evidence is not relative to the criteria. So that's definitely maybe not necessary, according to one of the participants.
So chat user who said that, could you give us some examples if you're interested in sharing? I'm not questioning it. I agree with you, but I'm just trying to see. Other thoughts?
Someone mentioned password protection. Document limits accessibility by reviewer.
Good. Good. Too much evidence for a single criterion. That's interesting, right? So we want to look at criterion standard 3, criterion 2, which has to do with faculty, right? So there may be some information here that might be sort of shaved out of the evidence inventory.
I've seen this reference a few times, but a couple participants mentioned to not include links to Middle States policies.
Right. Like what would we do? What would team members do with that, right? In terms of evaluating compliance. Okay, success coach. Yeah, the term success coach, we probably need a glossary. Maybe they have one already, I don't know, but we would want to know if the success coach is an advisor or is it a faculty member? It's just not clear. Good one.
And someone made some distinctions between where certain evidence should be versus standard 5 and standard 2.
Okay, nice.
Vague descriptions of evidence in some cases, participant mentioned.
Nice. I do sort of like the general documents approach, but I'm wondering if general documents are things that they would provide for all institutions in the institutional portal, some of them. Catalog, some institutions have multiple catalogs, undergraduate catalog, graduate catalog. So that might need some work in terms of defining that. Some institutions use bulletin and whatever, but obviously that wouldn't be required here. Good.
And this is a question, way in the beginning, this participant said, what can be done to ensure there is sufficient information for evaluators to do their work?
Great, the perennial question, right? How much is enough? And the way that I answer this is, if you can, using the things that Terrence identified, if you can maybe identify just in a paragraph is enough what your policies and procedures are with regard to something. And then you can provide a representative sample or a number of representative samples that are current and demonstrate current compliance, then that's sufficient. The sampling is going to be a debate on your campuses, right? What samples do we include? And so if this were standard 3, which it is, and their academic program listings, I would probably provide in the evidence inventory a listing of programs with enrollment so that evaluators can look at that, then look at the evidence you provided to see if it's representative, right? So sometimes an institution will provide only their accredited programs that equate to about 10% of their student body, but they don't provide anything else. So that wouldn't be representative. So sometimes to control for that, one would just provide either in the self-study narrative or the evidence inventory, a listing of programs by enrollment to sort of frame that argument that it is sufficient and representative.
So we have a question for you. Can we provide, as the presenters, recommendations for naming convention that reviewers appreciate?
Sure. So it is likely better to provide what here Poughkeepsie Institute has done, and that as a minimum, in some of these, like 2A, they say rigor and coherence. And then for each document, because sometimes they're file names, you might consider putting rigor and coherence : policy. But if you look at the slide, the second page, it says rigor and coherence policy on policies, which would mean that somebody's providing a policy compendium, it would appear, for all policies at the institution, which means somebody would have to rifle through all the policies to see where the single policy on rigor and coherence is. So what I would do is I would maybe use a file convention that says 2A rigor and coherence policy, right? Then we would know that that's what it has something to do with. So I definitely would reference the standard. I would definitely reference the sort of which criterion it is, and then something that, for lack of a better term, parrots what the standard gets to. So 2A, for example, would be, I believe, academic programs or something. And just be careful about those things.
Well, it seemed as if the use of links became a popular topic in the chats. We do have a policy as it relates to using links. Can you speak to that, and then the occasions where links are appropriate?
Sure. Links rely on a degree of technological consistency that I'm not sure would be appropriate to rely on. So I've heard terrible stories of institutions that use link after link, and then just something has broken in between the institution and the evaluator, or the evaluators, their technological competence isn't as good as we would want. And that's why we really, really don't like links within the self-study document necessarily. We do offer institutions an opportunity to provide a limited number of links in the institutional portal, but we very, very much discourage the use of links, say, within an evidence inventory. I know that's a big ask, because in some cases that might seem efficient, but my last review of the evidence inventory, it would appear that half of the institutions I looked at, their link was just a web page. So they would say admissions performance, and they'd include a link, and it would just go to the admissions page. But that's not, that doesn't give us the information we need. It just gives us the, we don't know. If the purpose was to provide the link to show admissions performance for yield, melt, application conversion, providing us with the link to the admissions office still begs the question of where the information is located. And that's why we really discourage the use of links, because somebody's going to have to manage all of those links shortly, like 6 weeks before the visit, to make sure they all work when evaluators are looking at it, and certainly during the visit. and certainly after the visit while commissioners are reviewing team reports and they may be accessing information. So that's why we really discourage the use of links if possible. Terrence, did anything else come up on chat? Or are we
the chat is buzzing. So
oh,
I definitely have more coming from
okay.
chat. So we have a question. Let's see here. How would Poughkeepsie ensure they've met the comprehensive expectation? I.e., would they have to reference individual units or committees such as Gen Ed committee? Where would the evaluators like to find the names of the specific leaders they may want to consult?
Yeah, great question. So I think in this case, we would likely want to provide information about, let's say it's, well, let me think, qualifications. Let's say it's 2B qualifications. And we want to make sure that we confirm and clarify that the institution's in compliance in substantial measure, which would mean across the institution, right? So it would be helpful at a minimum to provide a table in the evidence inventory with, for example, the percentage of faculty with terminal degrees, or the percentage of part-time faculty or something like that, and then presented by unit, by department, so that so an evaluator can see, you know, that there is compliance across the institution. It's up to the institution what it feels comfortable with, but I've seen institutions that do a very, very good job by producing a sort of table. Sometimes they put in the self-study report itself, and then they provide a policy and process statement on how they regularly review this information to make sure they're complying with their own policies, something of that sort.
All right. So just to give you a time check, we're at 3:11. Do we want to take more chats here or
Q&A? Yeah, that would be great. Great job. You didn't take my primary red meat, and that was the web address that has, I think it's our Middle States site, that there's something wrong with the link. I did that on purpose or whatever, but that's okay. Maybe another time, but it was good. You all appear to have worked very hard. Really great questions and comments on the chat, and I appreciate that very much. Let's go to Q&A in our final 15 minutes, and go from there. Somebody wants to go back to the question about, and I can't read the rest for some reason. I'm sorry.
All right, so I will open up the Q&A. Let us start with this question. Are you recommending highlighting and outlining as shown here, or is it just this for this presentation?
I put that in here to highlight for the purposes of the presentation, for the slide, but there's nothing wrong in an exhibit to highlight. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good idea. In fact, to allow an evaluator to know where to go. If it's like a 4-page document containing something like the faculty qualification, time to degree information or something, and then you outline on the very bottom the institutional average and the unit average or something, that's very much appreciated by a lot of evaluators. Again, that's not required. Be careful. I don't want to scare people. Other questions?
There was a question initially about the poll of asking why did we limit it to 1, and I can dive in. It was more of a technical challenge that we had with regard to multiple choice, for the poll. We definitely weren't condoning that you only have one choice. Obviously, depending on the institution and of course the creativity that a number of institutions have with regard to the evidence inventory. There could be a hybrid of some of those choices. So that was only for this presentation, choosing one option for policies.
That's a good question, certainly.
But I do have another question. What is the relationship between the evidence inventory in the Middle States portal and the evidence inventory referred to in this presentation?
So in the evidence inventory portal and provided by the commission, really you're going to see sort of like each standard divided by each criteria with opportunities to upload. And that's where the issue of file names becomes really important, right? So there's that. There are instances, however, when and I say this to my institutions, you often want a backup plan. So let's say, I know Terrence, you and I were talking about this prior to the workshop. What happens if you want to evaluate your institutional priorities, right? So how do you, what do you do to provide information for them? And there's several ways to do it. One of them is to have a backup. Sort of, when I was at an institution, we actually used a wiki. Now I'm dating myself because that was like 12 years ago, and there are better ways to do it. But it was very helpful because although we had, you know, one system that was formal, we also had a backup in case the evaluators asked for even more information. The best example would be you provide sample syllabi, right? And for some reason, an evaluator wants to see a broader sample. You want to have on the ready, you know, an ability to provide additional syllabi, and you want to be on the ready for that, right? Should that be requested. So use the institutional portal provided by the commission judiciously. There's a lot of room for improvement in terms of institutions using the portal. We're still seeing file names that are really unusual or not very descriptive. And so I would get together with your evidence inventory team and ask questions about what's going to be most impactful. And it's going to have something to do with the fact that the file name conventions that you have. So I think one example in the packet was, I think there was a label that said something like, yeah, S2_1_A. So we're seeing a lot of that, but we don't know what that means. Probably has something to do with standard 2, which might be a problem. I don't know, but we just don't know what that means. So a good strategy is to get together and write down the documents you feel are going to be best, and then start to limit it down as you go along.
Our next question goes like this. I like the recommendation to include a guide/grid to all documents included in the evidence inventory for each standard. Where should that go? First item in the first criterion for each standard?
So some institutions, what they're doing, there's a couple of institutions that did this really, really well last cohort. In the introduction, now they were a smaller institution, but in the for each chapter, they were doing a standard space design. They provided a table, and another institution provided at the very end, where they provided basically a graphic box, and then it said, these are the criteria, and these are the standards. I mean, these are the documents. Kind of like the Pennsylvania College of Health Sciences approach in one of the slides. But they provide that at the end of each chapter in order to give the evaluators a fairly good sense of what evidence they're providing. Certainly, the evaluators are going to go to the institutional portal, but at a minimum, they're being very proactive in saying they're saying you'll be able to confirm and clarify based upon the following, and they provide the criteria and they provide a limited list of some of the most impactful documents. It's an emerging practice that I find very succinct and very helpful.
Right. Our next question, are there any limits to how many pieces of evidence can be submitted to a particular criterion? Second part of that question is it acceptable to submit the same piece of evidence for more than one standard or criterion?
Great questions. So my understanding is that there are not a lot of limits. I don't know, Terrence, if that's your experience too, but when I go to the evidence inventory, I'm not seeing and I'm not hearing from my institutions that they're challenged with regard to the number of files that they're able to upload. So in answering how many, I don't know if there is a limit, but I'm not aware of our institutions hitting that limit. But that begs the question, of course, you don't want to provide too many files, right? And so that's going to be part of your institutional strategy. Yeah, the real question of redundancy. So there, the number one exhibit, if I remember right, from our latest analysis is strategic plans. So strategic plans are relevant to standard 1. They're relevant to standard 3, so for some, standard 4, standard 6, and standard 7. And so they either upload the strategic plan as one of the few documents that they can include. I think we have a limit of 5 or 10 that they can just upload. What some institutions do is they go ahead and they are redundant because they want evaluators to sort of get in and get out. So they think of it as a checklist, right? And they go through each element, and sometimes they repeat those. And the argument of those institutions is that it is efficient, although it may not be so, because it facilitates review as evaluators go through each criterion by criterion. So sometimes they do provide a document in several places in the institutional portal. The other approach that folks use or institutions use is they'll have a document that says go there, right? But the weakness of that approach is that you click on it, you're in the depth of standard 3, and you're clicking on the information, and it says go to standard 1, item D, and then you click on another thing that says go to standard 6, item F, right? And so you always have to go back into the standard 3, and then you have to go back into another standard. So it appears as though an emerging practice is for institutions to limit the redundancy, but to say there's just stuff that we really need to repeat ourselves on, like a mission statement or something like that. Another approach is, let's say it is a strategic plan, but instead of providing the whole strategic plan document, item by item by item, they provide the whole strategic plan as the upload of documents in general. And then they provide sort of pieces of the strategic plan, if possible, as it relates to each standard. The question before is, what about highlighting? There's an opportunity to highlight the portions of the strategic plan that directly relate to that standard.
Thank you. We have another question. What does Middle States expect for evidence of criterion 2, and in quotes, sufficient in number?
Great question. So we do not define, obviously, any measure, metric, or piece of evidence, but an institution would need to argue through its documentation or evidence how it evaluates that it has sufficient coverage of faculty or success coaches or whatever that might mean, what that means to you, right? So we'll have specialized institutions, and they have a policy because they have so many labs that say you can't have more than 20 faculty per course or laboratory session. And then you'll have another that says, we're fine with a 30-to-1 ratio of some sort. So we don't tell you, but you do want to be able to provide the trend information and then have be prepared for a narrative in the self-study report or a conversation with an evaluator about what sufficiency of faculty means. Think of the extremes. So if it says you're sufficient in number and you have 100 faculty 100 students per faculty, that might be seen as a bit odd. Now, what other institutions do is in order to achieve sort of address that issue, is they provide trend information of their competitors or their peer institutions to show that they're in the ballpark of what like institutions are. But short answer, we don't tell you, we don't have a bright line indicator for that. So it's better to provide a method that shows you are sufficient because our peer institutions, we're in the ballpark, would probably be good.
All right. So in a standard approach, do you recommend that the working group for evidence inventory has a liaison for each standard to support the evidence collection, or that working group by each standard collect them?
Either. So I know that sounds awful, like I'm punting, but I have seen institutions work very effectively where they have one member in each working group whose assignment is to work with the evidence inventory. Most institutions have some sort of strategy where the steering committee does that, but I've also seen institutions have a whole different working group whose sole assignment is evidence inventory. So there are a lot of different approaches throughout the commission, and they seem to work for them. It kind of depends on your culture, right? I know that it's common for us to say, just have the librarians do it. The problem with that is the librarians don't know the inner workings of your departments on things. You don't want to rely too much, but they're very helpful on labeling and that sort of thing to create an effective evidence inventory.
All right, we have a couple more questions. This one I'll read as is, but I think it may be maybe another interpretation. It says, is there a list of must be, and that's in quotes, evidence/documents for each criterion? So that might be a must have. So I'm not sure if that's the case or not, but is there a list of must have evidence/documents for each criterion?
There is not, and I'll tell you why. There are some really good candidates for it. Like I mentioned, strategic plan, right? Or things like that. But because we have so many differing institutions, some are specialized institutions, others are very big institutions with different ways of doing things. It's hard to create a must-have list because we want our institutions to be able to provide that. I'm not sitting here and saying, hey, we're all, all we are all about is creativity. What I'm saying is that there are so many good practices across the commission that I would consider reaching out to those. There are some schools that have done just a fabulous job of it, but we don't provide that list because inevitably that list is going to get longer and longer and longer, and then we might end up confusing institutions.
So Dr. McKittrick, this is a portal question, which I will read to you and see whether or not we can answer it. The Middle States Evidence Portal says, quote, please note that documents uploaded to the evidence library may not be deleted from the library, close quote. However, you can remove the document associated with a specific criteria at any time, if you so desire. Does this mean that if we upload evidence and decide it's not relevant, that we can remove it?
That is a technical question that I think we should ask the whoever is responsible in staff. If you're interested, send me an email, whoever wrote that, and then I will see if I can get an answer for you.
Okay. All right, let us move to one more question. So this relates back to your conversation about links and websites. So this individual says, so if the website information is evidence, should the information that is where it's located on the website be turned into a PDF for the evidence inventory?
Well, you could definitely. I mean, definitely you can make a PDF of the website. The issue becomes, is it just a representation of the website without specific information, right? So and I'm not saying someone who asked that question that's what you're doing, but there are issues where it'll say like faculty sufficient in number, and they'll provide a screenshot of the Division of Academic Affairs or the Division of Institutional Research, where I assume something is in there. But can you imagine being an evaluator, multiply that by 20 and having to say, I'm glad that I have a PDF, but I really need to find out where the information can be found. Yeah, PDFs are fine, but just make sure that it provides information that is efficient enough that allows the evaluator to directly and in a timely fashion get that information.
Let's see. Another question. If a big document like a college catalog is being used, should a subset of the college catalog be used, and in parentheses a PDF of that section, or just the page number where the page number of the information where the catalog will be used? So it's basically saying setting up the whole thing or proportioning the PDF.
Yeah, so this is terrible for me to say. It sound like I'm punting again. Because I just said that we don't have required documents, right? But I think if your institution is huge, that would be a candidate for uploading the general documents that are there. I think there's that section. I'm a fan of identifying your policy, identifying your procedure, identifying who's responsible, and then attaching the section from the catalog, perhaps. But you still have to focus on assessment, right? You still have to evaluate that. So the short answer is yes to both, but then you want to get into, can an evaluator get in, confirm, and get out? That's what you want. And sometimes taking portions of the catalog might work, but never forget the assessment and evaluation piece as well, of course.
Great. Well, we've reached our time limit, and we just want to thank all of you for taking time out to learn more about the evidence inventory. And on behalf of Dr. Sean McKittrick and myself, have a great day, and we look forward to talking to you once again.
Thank you, everyone. Good group. Bye-bye.